Hey everyone, for today's tutorial we are going to be sewing up a boxy bag. I already have 3 boxy bag tutorials on my channel, but the reason I'm doing this one today is that I don't have a fully lined boxy bag that doesn't have any binding. So that is what we're going to be doing today. This is a medium-sized boxy bag. It's about 7.5 inches wide, 3 3/4 of an inch tall, and 3 inches deep, and I really like the size of this one. I played around with this pattern a lot. I was trying to reinvent the wheel here, and it turns out the boxy bag is already pretty good exactly as it is. There are a few little things that we're going to do with the lining to help it not sag down inside of your bag and to give your pouch a little bit more structure. I've got some strategies to try to reduce some of the bulk that can create problems in your side seams. We're going to be doing a double zipper, but you can adapt it to have just one zipper pull. I'm going to give you the measurements if you don't want to print out the pattern pieces, but I do have a PDF template of the pattern available to you. There will be a link in the description of this video so you can download that free pattern template. So let's get going. For my boxy bag, I am using quilting weight cotton. I've used a single layer of interfacing on the exterior and lining pieces, and I'm also going to be adding an extra section just to the middle of the pattern piece to add that extra stability that will help it not to sag down in the middle. I'll also be using Fusible Fleece to stabilize. You can use foam or Decaville Light instead. I like the Fusible Fleece because it makes it easy to turn the bag out. The first thing that we're going to do is cut out our pattern pieces. You will need 2 exteriors and 2 linings. These are cut from the same pattern piece. If you've followed me for a while, seen some of my other videos, you'll know that I like to have a lining piece that is smaller than my exterior so that you don't get any sagging. The problem with a boxy bag is that the way that you construct it when you box your corners, it's very tricky to use a lining piece that is adjusted to fit more snugly inside of your bag. I experimented a lot to try to come up with a way to do this, and for this style of boxy bag, I found after making about 15 of these that it just was going to be too tricky and too difficult to translate into a tutorial for you. So instead, what I have done is added more stabilizer to help the lining to stay nicely structured, and also when we close up our lining, we are going to be closing it up on a curve rather than a straight line to try to take some of the extra slack out of our lining piece. When you're cutting out your pattern, you can cut it out directly from the pattern template exactly as it is, or you can cut it out using measurements. I'm going to cut this piece out using measurements so that you can see how I would do that. It is very important with this pattern that your measurements are exact. So if you have trouble taking your measurements with a ruler, I recommend using the pattern piece. Your starting rectangle size is going to be 12 inches wide by 7 3/8 of an inch tall. I have applied my interfacing to my fabric already so that I can cut it all at one time. The first thing that I'm going to do is cut the height of the pattern. So that is 7 3/8 of an inch. The next thing to do is to cut it to exactly 12 inches wide. Once you've cut the main rectangle, grab your pen and using your quilting ruler, we're going to draw in the lines to cut out the boxed section on the side. Working from the bottom, the first thing that you're going to do is draw your line 3/8 of an inch up from the long end. This is your bottom seam. When you're using your quilting ruler, you want to make sure that you are accounting for the line that you're drawing when you're measuring your seam allowance. So if you have the little black line on your ruler, you want that line to sit on top of your drawn in line. I'm now going to measure 2 inches up from the line that I just drew. And I'm also going to double check my measurement from the first line to make sure that it is 2 3/8 of an inch so that I know that I am getting an exact line. The more exact you are in your cutting, the more exact your boxed corners will be. I'm also not going to draw all the way in. I'm just going to draw about 2 1/4 inches in. I'm then going to flip it around and I'm going to measure 2 inches down from the top. And again, just drawing to just over 2 inches. And now we need to measure the box corners. This is where it gets a little tricky and why it matters to be exact. take your ruler and you want this section here to be 3 inches tall and 1 7/8 of an inch deep. So you want the line that you drew to be directly on the line on your ruler, and you can also double check the measurements at each of these lines to make sure that it is correct. So measuring down from the top, you want it to be 2 inches, 5 inches, 7 inches, 7 3/4. And when you're happy with that and that it is all squared up, you can draw your line here, flip it around, and do the same on the other side. It's upside down now. So just check your measurements here also. This depth here is 1 7/8, 3/8 here. That would be 2 3/8, 5 3/8, 7 3/8. And draw that line. And the important part here is to make sure that this distance for your box corner is exactly 3 inches. And you want to note where the measurement is in relation to your line. If your line is outside of the measurement, when you're cutting, you're going to cut inside the line. If it's exact, you can cut on the line. Now I'm going to grab my scissors and I'm just going to cut these corners out. When you're cutting the exterior, you're going to keep 2 of these sections to use for your tabs at the end of your zipper. I use a nice sharp pair of scissors so I can get right up to the corner. And then you can check that against your pattern piece to make sure that you have it correct. Repeat that for all 4 of your pattern pieces, making sure to keep 2 of the cutouts for your tabs. We're going to cut those tabs to be 1.5 inches wide by the 3 inches tall that they were when we cut them. In addition to these pieces, you will need 2 pieces of interfacing that are 6 by 7 inches that you will center on your lining pieces. The long edge is parallel to the long edge of your lining. You want to make sure that you have at least 1/4 inch gap between the line we drew at the bottom and the lower edge of your second piece of interfacing. And that is going to help us when we take the curved shape when closing up our lining. You're going to fuse those in place. And then on your exterior pieces, you're going to do a piece that is 7 inches wide and 6 1/4 of an inch tall, and have that centered on your piece a little closer to the lower edge here. I'm going to be showing you 2 different methods for reducing the bulk in this side of your bag here. Where you have the gusset seam join up with the side seams, it does get fairly bulky and can cause the shape of your bag to bow out a little bit, and it just doesn't look as nicely squared up. So I've got 2 different ways to do that, one which requires preparation beforehand. So we're going to go ahead and do that on just one side. You can see on the pattern piece, I have drawn in these angled dotted lines here, and that is our bulk reduction line. So we're going to transfer that marking onto our pattern pieces. I'm only going to be putting mine on one side of my bag, but you can put it on both if you decide to use this technique. If you're going to use the other technique or not worry about your bulk reduction, then you don't need to do this right now. Grab your ruler, or you can mark it directly from the pattern and cut that out. We're going to draw the diagonal lines on each of these inside corners. You're going to make a mark that is 5/8 of an inch down from the outside edge and 5/8 of an inch in from the inside edge, and just join those 2 lines. Repeat that on all of the corners. When you are drawing these lines in, you want to make sure that they are as exact as possible because we're going to be trimming those off. When I draw in my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, you can see that where my seam will be just misses this line by about 1/8 of an inch. So that is going to be close there. If you cut it too deep, then you're not going to be able to make that corner properly. So that is something that you want to be careful of. And if you're concerned, you can always take it in a little shallower. But this is what is going to allow us to reduce the bulk in that side seam. The next step is to mark all of the centers on your panels, marking the center top with a little tiny snip or with a mark of your pen. And I'm also going to mark the center of my boxed corners. I am lining up the center of the corner here, using these edges and here to mark the center, not the center of this entire piece because I still have my seam allowance here at the bottom. So I'm marking my center of just this section, ignoring the overhang on this end. I'm also going to mark the center of my zipper tape. And then I'm going to grab a pen and I'm going to make one more mark on my lining. And that mark is going to be 3.5 inches in from either outside edge to mark the limits of my turning hole. And I'm going to mark that on the seam allowance line that we drew. And now we're ready to start sewing. Take your 2 lining pieces and your 2 exterior pieces, and you're going to place them right sides together, lining up the bottom seam. We're going to clip along that seam, and then we are going to sew from one end to the other on the lining, stopping at the line here and sewing again on the other side of the opening, keeping the outside edge lined up, and just clip this section and do the same for the exterior piece. You can place a couple of clips at the top too, just to help keep everything lined up. Making sure that you are lining up your 2 bottom sections, which are the taller of the 2. And for the exterior, we will be sewing straight across the bottom, backstitching at the beginning and the end. Using a shorter stitch length and sewing straight down the 3/8 of an inch line that we drew in our prep phase. Backstitching at the beginning and the end. Do the same on the lining, backstitching at the outside edge. And when you come up to the line where we marked our opening, you're going to stop. You're going to backstitch away from that opening. Backstitch again well, keeping about 1/2 inch from that mark. Raise the needle. And then you're going to come down to the other mark. And you're not going to start right at the mark. You're going to start about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch beyond that mark. Lower your needle. Backstitch here so that I don't have loose or visible stitches at the limits of that opening. When you get to that mark, sew all the way to the other end and backstitch well. Trim your threads, and we are going to press open those bottom seams. Fold open the exterior. You're going to butterfly out that seam. You can, when you're cutting out your exterior, choose, rather than cutting 2 separate pieces and joining them, you can use the dotted line here as your fold line. And to press that open, I'll do it with my seam roller, but I will also be pressing that with my iron to get it nice and flat. And if you like, you can top stitch on either side of this seam. I am not going to be top stitching mine, but you would go ahead and do that now if that was something that you wanted to do. We're going to do the same on our lining piece, but we're only going to be pressing it open to the mark. I'm going to go and press both of those with my iron. Once you have those seams pressed, what we're going to do is open out the hole in the lining. The reason for having the second piece of interfacing shorter on the lining piece is so that we can fold open that lining a little wider. I'm just going to crease that down. It kind of looks a little bit like a mouth. I'm just going to crease that, pulling it out from the center, close to where the lower edge of that extra piece of interfacing is. And once you've got that creased open, we're going to iron that as well. So you can see that we've got a gape of about 1/2 inch there in the center of our lining. You can set your lining piece aside and grab your exterior. we're going to be applying our stabilizer. I have a piece of stabilizer that is cut to 7 by 12.5 inches from my 7 by 14 inch requirement. You can do it as 2 separate pieces if you want to do it as 7 by 6.25 of an inch. And what I'm going to do is place that straight down the middle of my exterior panel. If you had 2 pieces, they would meet up here. You can, if you like to have a stronger base on your bag, also add a small piece of Peltex or Decaville Heavy in the middle. I would do that about 2.5 inches tall and 7 inches wide if you wanted to add that in too. So we're going to fuse that in place, and the other thing that we're going to do is put some extra stabilizer here at the ends. In the interest of saving material, I have cut mine as 4 separate pieces from the upper edge of my 14-inch piece, but you can instead cut them as 1 piece. And that is just going to lay here at the side, again centered up. My 4 individual pieces are 1.5 by 1 3/4, but if you wanted to do it as 1 piece for each side, then you would just cut your piece to be 3 inches tall by 1 3/4 of an inch wide. By doing it this way, it all comes out of the same 7 by 14 piece. They were originally across the top here. So I'm going to go and fuse that in place. My stabilizer is centered in the middle of my exterior with the extra pieces at the side here. I'm going to be using steam to get that to adhere to my exterior. And then I'm going to let it cool before I work with this piece any further. While you're waiting for your fusible fleece to cool, take a pen, a ruler, and your 2 tabs that are cut to 1.5 inches wide and 3 inches tall. I'm going to draw a line straight down the middle. Place some double-sided tape on that line. And I'm only going to be placing it in the middle section. I'm going to leave about 1/2 inch on either end because we will be trimming this tab also to help reduce bulk at the zipper. Fold the long edges in to meet the line. And then press that. Working from the back, we're just going to make small snips at the corner here. We are cutting so that we still have 1/8 of an inch at the outside, and I'm going to angle up about 3/4 of an inch towards the center. And that is going to help reduce that bulk when we install the tab. Again, these bulk reduction strategies are optional. You don't have to do them, but it does get to be a lot of layers at that side of your boxy bag. So just angling in those corners. If when you've clipped, you've revealed some of your double-sided tape, you can peel that back a bit. What we're then going to do is sew around each of these tabs at 1/4 of an inch, starting and stopping at the end of the tab, backstitching well there. And once it is sewn, I will fold it in half, and then I will baste the 2 raw short ends together at 3/8 of an inch, just putting a line across here. Take your exterior and your completed tab, and you want to position it centered over the bottom seam, hanging about 1/2 inch off. You may find that using a ruler or a pen to help keep it lined up in the center there is reasonable. I am going to baste that in place, but before I do so, to make sure that it stays straight and doesn't turn at all, I'm just going to pop a piece of painter's tape over that. You can use clips or a staple. I'm just going to put some tape here, and I'm going to baste it at 1/8 of an inch. If you are going to use the tape, make sure that you keep it clear of where you will be sewing. Once I've sewn those basting stitches, I'm going to remove the closer piece of painter's tape. I'm going to leave the outside one there for now. We're now going to install our zipper. If you haven't already marked the center on your zipper tape, go ahead and do that now. And we're also going to cinch the ends so that there's no fraying. I'm using zipper by the yard. Mine is cut to 13 inches long. My zipper tape is 1 1/4 inch wide. This is the width that I recommend for this pattern. If you have a narrower zipper, then when we take our seam allowance for installing the zipper, you are going to want to narrow your seam allowance from the 5/16 inch that I'm going to be using. I'm doing a double pull on my zipper, so I need to make sure that my zipper heads are going to line up neatly in the middle and not have a bubble there. The way to do that is to make sure that when you put your zipper tape back together, you're putting it back exactly as you found it. Take a pair of scissors or a pen and have a look at the end of your zipper tape. You're going to look to see which side of the zipper tape has the tooth sticking further out. On mine, it's the right-hand side, so I'm going to make a mark on the right-hand side of the zipper. I put a small snip at the corner. You can melt that if you wish, and do the same on the other end. And when we put our pulls on, I will make sure to start from the side that I have marked. Take double-sided tape or clips if you prefer, and we're going to put it along the top and the bottom of our exterior and our lining. You want to keep your double-sided tape right up to the edge of your material so that your tape is not within your stitch line. I am using 1/8 inch double-sided tape. Working first with your exterior piece, you're going to take your zipper and you're going to fully separate it. Peel off one side of your double-sided tape, removing the backing, and place your zipper teeth side down onto your exterior so that the edge of your tape that doesn't have the zipper teeth lines up with the edge of your material, with the centers lined up, and press your zipper tape down onto your exterior, making sure that it is as straight as you can get it against the edge. You will have a little bit of overhang on either end. Try not to stretch your tape, but make sure that you're placing it down nice and smooth so you don't get any ripples. Press that down and do the same for the other side. I'm now going to baste this zipper in place at 1/8 inch. Baste at a seam allowance of slightly greater than 1/8 inch so that you're not sewing into your double-sided tape. Trim all of those threads and grab your lining piece. You're going to place your lining right sides together with your exterior. Line up the center mark with the center of your zipper tape and your exterior. Line up the outside edge and then press your lining in place. Do the same for both sides of your zipper and make sure that your edges are lining up at the sides here and that everything is nice and flush along the top and the bottom. We're going to take this over to the sewing machine and we're going to be sewing at 5/16 inch. If your zipper tape is narrower than 1 1/4 inch, then you're going to want to sew with a seam allowance of 1/4 inch so that you don't lose too much of your width at the upper portion of your bag. With zipper tape that is 1 1/4 inch, sewing with an exact 5/16 inch seam allowance along here will mean that your finished upper width of your bag will be 4 inches, which will match the bottom section of your bag. The easiest way to work out what seam allowance to use for installing your zipper is to use a seam allowance that is equal to 1/4 of your zipper width. So if you're using 1 1/4 of an inch, you want to use 5/16 of an inch. If your zipper tape is 1 inch wide, you're going to use 1/4 of an inch, and that is going to mean that your stitch line is going to fall right in the middle of one of your sides of zipper tape. And when you fold it out, this distance here will account for the distance here, and that will give you the correct size when you join your zipper together. So I'm going to sew down here using my zipper foot, making sure that I'm getting a nice straight stitch line, back stitching at the beginning and at the end using 5/16 of an inch all the way down. I like to check that measurement with a ruler to make sure that it is exact, but I also use my presser foot width to guide me. After I've sewn that seam, I like to check to make sure that my line of stitches is straight, and if there is anywhere that my seam allowance is not quite exact, I like to go over that section, just back stitch a little bit before, place an additional line of stitches at the correct seam allowance, and back stitch again. We're now going to turn this out and top stitch. Before we do so, we are going to trim our bulk reduction lines. I'm only going to trim mine on one side. I'm going to trim it on the lining and the exterior piece across this corner. If you wanted to, you could trim that with a rotary cutter and do both layers at the same time. And now we need to turn out our bag so we can top stitch that zipper. We're just going to turn it straight out through the side. I like to pull on my zipper tape a little to help it to come out. And then I will crease the lining and the exterior away from the zipper tape. If you've made my logie pouch, you may notice that the construction of this lined boxy is very similar to the turned line version of the logie pouch. And the way that we have done the lining here, you can also do that on the logie pouch to help with loose linings in that pattern. The reason that I didn't draft the lining piece like that is because it makes it tricky with your edges here. Once that's all pressed down, we're going to top stitch on either side of our zipper tape at 1/8 of an inch. You want to be sure that your lining and your exterior are both pulled taut back from that zipper tape. You can even put some clips along the edges here to keep that back so that your lining doesn't roll up underneath, as if it rolls up, that's going to make it harder to box up your corners neatly. I am going to start in the edge seam allowance, pivot and sew across, turn again here so that my back stitching is hidden at the sides. We're sewing through the exterior and the lining, top stitching beside both sides of the zipper. After you've done your top stitching, turn it back inside out, and we're going to put on our zipper pulls. Going back to where we marked our zipper tape, starting from the side that we angled, I'm going to take one of my zipper pulls, slide it on that side first, leading with the rounded side, pinch my zipper tape to the side to pull the teeth as far to the right as I can. Take the left side, slide it up from the bottom, and when I feel them meet in the middle, I'm going to pull the right side down, and then they will click, and then I can push from the flat end. And then my zipper head is on. And now I'm looking to make sure that it's gone on in the correct order. My right-sided tooth is still further out, so I know that this is the original orientation of my zipper. So I can slide that pull all the way on. Come to the other end. Taking a look at my mark, it's on the left side this time. So I'm going to start on the left side, slide it on till the zipper teeth are just inside the zipper head, pinching it. Take the right side, slide it up from the bottom. When they meet, I pull the left side down until I feel it click, and then I push the back of the pull. Not quite lined up. And then slide it on. And I can see that the zipper tooth on the left-hand side is further out, which is where I wanted it to be based on my mark. So I can slide that one on too. And then my pulls should be lined up in the middle. And you can see if I slide it towards the edge, you can see here that they are perfectly lined up with no bubbles. So that is good. We're now going to close up the side seams. You're going to line up the center bottom seam of your exterior, which is going to end up being the side seam of your bag where we've basted our tab in place with our zipper tape. So you want to line up the outside edges and the center line with your zipper tape. I'm going to line up just the exterior to begin with, and the width of the bottom part of your bag should be equal in width to your zipper panel if you've used exact seam allowances. If your zipper panel is not exact, that's okay. Match up your centers and we will account for that when we're boxing our corners. So we're clipping together the two exteriors and also the lining part of the zipper panel. I also like to place some clips around the boxed corners to keep the angles correct. Again, just doing the exteriors for the moment. We're going to baste those 3 layers together first because the bulk here at the zipper and with our tab can make it difficult to get a good stitch line there. So we're going to sew at either end here at 1/4 inch, sewing through the 2 exterior layers and the lining of the zipper panel. So just keeping the lining out of the way, we're just going to sew along here. And I've got a hump jumper here if I need it to help with the bulk. Because we have trimmed down the tab, hopefully it is not too bad. I'm sewing along here at 1/4 inch. Take it slowly over the tape, reinforce a little. Same on the other side. And then revert to a regular stitch length and your 3/8 inch seam allowance. You're going to take the lower part of your lining. You're going to center up that seam with the center of your zipper tape. You're also going to line up the outside edges, and then you're going to be sewing your full side seam at the end of that zipper, 3/8 inch using a shorter stitch length, sewing through all of those layers. And because we have done the basting, it should stay nicely lined up. You want to make sure that you are sewing outside of the basting stitch line so that you cannot see that stitch line on the inside of your bag. Back stitching well at the beginning and at the end. Use a hump jumper, but because we have basted that connector and the end of the zipper in place already, you don't need to reinforce this seam. A hump jumper will help you get over that section and reduce the likelihood of any skipped stitches with the bulk there. You can also press that area with key fob pliers before sewing to help your sewing machine get through all of those layers. The same at the other end. trim those threads and remove all of your clips. We've already done bulk reduction on one end. If you didn't do it by cutting the corners before you started sewing, the other option for bulk reduction is just to trim your seam allowance beyond where your basting line of stitches is. And you just cut a little section through all of those layers to reduce the bulk in that side seam. The next thing to do is to box our corners, but before we do that, we need to check that they are exact so that we have our exact finished boxy bag. Grab your ruler and you're going to measure in from the folded edge to your inside stitch line, and you want that to equal 1.5 inches. It should be 1.5 inches from the corner to the fold and 1.5 inches from the corner to the stitch line. Check all of those. If you have done the bulk reduction snip, then you're going to look up, continue along from where your stitch line is. A cutting mat is helpful, so you're measuring from this line, even though you've got the little snip taken out there, from this line to the corner there. You can also check that the center marks that you made for your box corners are indeed still in the center. Mine are lining up, but if yours are not lining up, then you can correct it using your ruler to make sure that it is 1.5 inches squared. And another way to check it is to turn your bag out so that the right side is out. Albeit this is a little of a fiddlier way of doing it. Go to your corners. You're going to line everything up. Fold out your seam. You can remove that double-sided tape now. And you're just going to flatten your bag out the same way as you would if you were going to bind this corner. You're going to line up your centers, smooth everything out, and then you want to make sure that you have a straight line here. This here should be a 45-degree angle. So you can take your ruler and you can just check that. Check that it's lined up. And that's good. And if you notice any sections that are sticking further out, then you can just use your ruler and trim it so that it is nice and flat. Mine looks good, so I'm going to turn it back out the wrong way again so that we can get our corners ready to box them up. We're going to be boxing up 4 corners. We're going to be boxing the lining and the exterior together so that the lining will stay nicely tucked up into the corners. Slide your zipper pull to the center if it's not already. But do not close it up completely if you have trouble opening it from the back. Starting at one corner, you're going to open out your exterior and you're lining up the center marking that we made with the seam at the center of the side of the bag. And you're going to clip along that edge and it should be nice and flat. It does feel a little awkward doing this. The important thing is having a nice flat edge. If your zipper panel was off, you may find that you have one side sticking out slightly. You want this here to be a 45-degree angle, and then you will know that you have it nice and straight for the side of your bag. I like to clip the exterior and then the lining. I'm going to fold it kind of awkwardly. Open that out, and then it's going right on top of your exterior, folding it at the side there, and then you're going to clip it all together. So I have a lining corner and an exterior corner, and you're just going to need to flatten this out, and you want to make sure that everything is all lined up at the edge. And the first thing we're going to do is baste down here at 1/8 of an inch. Then we're going to check to make sure that we caught all of those layers, and then we're going to sew it with the full 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Making sure that all of your edges are lined up, baste those corners together at 1/8 of an inch. I've got my pliers here to pull those edges out if I need to. My priority is getting the exterior lined up, and I'm just going to sew straight down this edge. This is the corner that I have not used the bulk reduction lines, so when I come to this seam here, if I need to use my hump jumper to get over it, I have that nearby. The more exact I get these layers of material lined up when I'm basting, the more exact my finished corners will be. After you've sewn that basting stitch, take a look at your seam and make sure that you have caught your exterior all the way along and that it is even. If you find that you have sections of your exterior that are not quite lined up at this seam here, you can unpick those stitches and sew it again. It often happens at the corner there. It tends to shift away, and use pliers to pull it out. This seam being lined up nice and straight is what is going to give you the straight seam on the side of your bag, giving you that nice squared shape on your boxy bag. So I like to make sure that that is perfectly correct. Once you're happy with the basting stitch, you can sew your full seam allowance, smooth it all out, and again, working from the exterior side, because that is the side that you will see. That is the side I like to work from. I'm going to sew 3/8 of an inch parallel to this side of my material. And that is creating the side of my boxy bag. This seam here is the seam that we are sewing now. So you want to make sure it's nice and straight. Take care when you get to your bulk, if you need your hump jumper, to get over that so you don't miss any stitches. And keep it nice and straight and parallel so that the edges of your bag are like this and not like this or wavy. Using 3/8 of an inch. Take care at the bulk that you're not skipping any stitches when you come off the side seam. Back stitching again. And I then like to take a look and make sure that this line is nice and straight. And if I need to, I can go over it again. I also check it from the lining side. And if you like, you can just sew one extra row of stitches. And you really want to make sure that at these corners here, everything is nice and smooth and not bunched up at all. And that's your first corner done. When I am choosing which order to box my corners in, I like to go from one side at one end to the other side at the same end and do those two, and then do the other two. The reason being that the way that you have to manipulate your bag to access the exterior and the lining corner, I find it is easier to work at one end first and then work at the other end. So we're going to tuck the corner that we just did back inside, and that will allow us to pull the lining on the other side at the same end out. The same for the exterior. And you're flattening it down so that the center mark lines up with the seam there. This center mark is on this piece here, and this is the seam. So we're lining up the little snip with that seam. You want that to be 180 degrees, a nice flat line. I always clip my exterior first, even though we're going to sew it at the same time. I find that it is easier to get my positioning. Smooth it out, clip in the center, clip at the side, which should be a 45-degree angle, smooth it out, clip at the other side, 45-degree angle, and nice and flat with those two seams lining up as flat as you can get them. You want this to be 45 degrees though. If your material here is not cut quite exactly, then it may sit a little off like this, but you want to have that 45 degrees there. Then I will add a couple of extra clips in the middle. Flip it over. Do the same thing for the lining. And again, we're kind of tucking the side we're not working on inside, and that allows the side we are working on to lay flat. Pull it out to flatten this. I do the center first. Take that center clip from the exterior off, line that up. So here we have all in a row, the exterior seam with the marking, the lining seam with the marking. Clip that all together in the middle, and then smooth out the lining corners, clip it at the side, clip it at this edge, making sure those materials are all nice and flat. And again, smooth that out. And then the same way as we did for the first side, we're going to baste here 1/8 of an inch, priority being the exterior material is nice and flat and lined up. Like see here, that's a little skew whiff. I'm just going to force that up there, clip it. Not really force it, it's where it wants to go. It's just pulled away because of the bulk of the bag. You can use staples if you like, but with the basting, I find that that is usually sufficient. And then if when I am sewing, it shifts, or after I've sewn the basting line, I can see that it has shifted, I will unpick just the part that has shifted. So if it's fine here, and then down here I've noticed it's pulled away, I will undo this little section, baste that, and then I will be good to sew my 3/8 of an inch seam. So we'll sew that and then sew the second seam. Take a look. I've got all of my linings. Check the exterior. And that's all there. So now smooth out the corner to make sure it's not bunching up at all. And then I'm going to sew down here at 3/8 of an inch, making sure that this part too is nicely smoothed out. You can keep your clips at the angled part to make sure that it's nice and smooth. Backstitching well. And you are sewing in a straight line. If the line you are sewing now has to pivot or turn at all, then you have a problem somewhere else, because this is the straight side seam of your bag, vertical side seam. Take a look, make sure that it is straight and parallel to the side, and then you can sew an extra line if you wish, just inside or just outside, depending on where exactly your stitch line fell. If your stitch line is not straight or not quite even all the way along, then just sew another line slightly outside to straighten that up. Those two are sewn up, so we're working now with the other end. This side is the side where I have made my bulk reduction snips. So when we are lining up our seam, it is not going to line up with the nice flat line right in the middle. Again, working from the exterior first, I'm going to flatten it out the same way as we did the first side. But when we line this one up, you can see that you have this gap here in the middle. You want to be careful that you're not pulling that open. If you pull it open, then your fabric at the corner there is not going to line up. So that's where this side angle becomes important. I clip that first. This is 45 degrees. This is nice and straight. Same on the other side. And then if you take a look here, you can see that the seam is here. And if it continued all the way up, you would want it to line up with that mark. So you can see it at the side. Lay it down. Positioning the lining can help it to sit where you want it to as well. So you can do the outsides of the lining and the exterior before you do the centers, which is the opposite to the way we did the other end. So smooth that out. You want this to line up nice and flat. Put your clips wherever you need to get it where you want it to be. Same at the other side, which is the bottom corner. Clips again. And now line up your centers. So the cutouts should line up and the little notches should line up. Sometimes it's helpful to just do it a little at a time while you try to get your positioning correct. Smooth that out. And when you are happy that you've got all of those edges lined up and the sides here are the angle they should be, the same way as we did on the other end, we are going to baste 1/8 of an inch and then check that we have caught all of the layers, that it is nice and straight, and that any of the corners have not pulled away, particularly paying attention to these corners here. And with the cutout, it also tends to sometimes pull away in the center. Doing the bulk reduction is optional if you feel like this is too fiddly for you, but in the finished product, I find that it does give me a nicer feel for my bag. But you can experiment both ways. Smoothing it as you need to. Check here that it's lined up. Looks good. Checking again that it hasn't pulled away where the bulk reduction is. Check. It's all lined up. And then sew again at 3/8 of an inch. Also make sure that it is smoothed out there at the center so you don't get any pinching at the side seam. Check. It's pretty straight, but I sewed an extra line on the other, so I'll do an extra one on this one as well. I've got 3 sewn and I'm going to repeat that for the last corner. I'm getting all of this lined up, and this last corner here I'm just really struggling with. So it is an option if you have a particular corner that you know is cut correctly, but you're still struggling because of the bulk when you're on your last corner in particular, you could separately baste just that little section and then clip it to the rest of your boxy bag so that you can get it all lined up the way it needs to be without the bulk causing you any problems. I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to baste that, and then I'm going to sew it. I'm going to keep my pliers nearby just to pull that out if I need to. So the bulk of the bag is here, so just trying to smooth that over. And I've got my pliers to help it. I'm just going to check that. I'm not even going to backstitch, I'm going to check it first. And I'm going to redo this little section. I'm just going to unpick those stitches. I'm going to sew this one separately. I'm just going to slide it up. So I really want that corner to be lined up properly. This is just a basting stitch, so we can trim anything we need to. And now that one is lined up, I can get my lining positioned over the top. Baste the lining to the exterior. Check it again. Okay, and that looks much better. So keeping all of these threads out of the way that I will snip, I'm just going to sew my 3/8 of an inch seam. Smooth everything out. Check that I'm happy. I'm going to sew one more line. And then I've got many, many threads to trim. Trim all of your threads, and then before you turn it, grab a ruler and just measure that the innermost line where you've boxed your corner is straight and it is even between the 4 corners. Mine is 3.5 inches. So I just want to make sure that it's the same on all of them. You can also compare them to each other. You can pop them all out. So you can check these two are the same. And check them all with your ruler. If you're unsatisfied with the symmetry, then you can sew another stitch line wherever you need to get that measurement to be even. That's what's going to give you the even height all the way around your bag. You can then turn your bag out through the hole in the lining. Poke at all of your corners from the inside. If you need extra poking, you can put your hand through the opening in the lining. I like to roll those seams. Something else to check, if you have done the bulk reduction on this one, I just haven't quite sewn it far enough and I can just see the corner there where I've snipped it. So I'm going to pop that particular corner back out through the lining. And I'm just going to sew in a little further just where that seam is to catch. It's just ever so slight, less than 1/16 of an inch. So I'm just going to take an extra stitch line inside there. I've just sewn that extra bit there. I can just pop that back out, just double check, and that looks good. Once you've got all of those corners poked out, the last thing we need to do is close up our lining. You're going to pull your lining up out through the opening and pull it taut. Then we're just going to clip along the folded edge. Your lining piece is folded well out of the way with that curve that we took when we pressed the mouth shape into our lining. And now we need to close this up. You can close this up with your sewing machine by sewing from outside of the opening, backstitching, and coming all the way across and finishing on the other side of your opening, or you can hand sew this closed with a ladder stitch. If you have used waterproof canvas, I recommend using your sewing machine to do it, but if you have used quilting cotton, by hand sewing it closed, you can get a nice flat bottom on your bag. You'll want to use thicker thread so that you can put some tension on it as you need to make sure that it is nice and tight inside of your lining. A thinner thread will snap with your hand sewing if you're not careful. I'll show you first closing up your lining using your machine. I've got my opening folded over and clipped in place. I'm going to be sewing with a seam allowance of about 1/16 of an inch, starting 1/2 an inch beyond where the opening is, backstitching well, continuing all the way along and backstitching at the other end. The other option for closing up your lining is to use a ladder stitch. If you don't do a lot of hand sewing, then this can feel a little intimidating, but with practice, you can get there. I am using a thicker thread. I've got a Mars 70 thread, and I've got a fairly large needle. And then I'm going to pull up my lining. I've already ironed the creases in. Tie a knot at the end of your thread. You can trim the tail. And then go to the back of where your fold is. And I like to start a little beyond where the opening is, the same way as we did using the sewing machine. And poke it right where that crease is. And because it's sewn here on the inside, you can put that straight through. Check the positioning on the other side. And then we can place our first stitch. Pull it up all the way. You don't want your thread to be too long because it can get tangled, but you do need it to be long enough to be able to sew across that entire opening. And pull that tight. And then we are going to place the next stitch next to the first stitch. And I'm going to be sewing in the crease that we ironed, not where I drew my seam allowance, but the fold where I have taken that curved seam allowance to take some of that slack out of the lining. So place my needle back right at the crease. Poke it out through the crease. I like to have my spacing for this no greater than about 1/8 of an inch, but it does get tricky sometimes. So often I will do my first pass and then I will go back and sew it again and fill in those gaps. Put the needle in again, and then I'm just going to poke it back out in the crease. Just getting a little tangled on my zipper pull there. Pull that up, and I don't pull it all the way tight at first. I do a couple of stitches, and then I will pull it tight when I've got part of the way along, and that's why I like to use a thicker thread. And you want to get your stitch as close to that crease that we made as you can, and that will help the bottom of the bag to line up nicely. This one here hasn't quite hit at that crease. If you've missed the crease, you can always go back over the top of that one. Come to the crease again. And we're just going to continue all the way along. And you can see here, this is why it's called a ladder stitch. Looks like little rungs of a ladder just going across there. And you're just going from one side to the other, directly across. And I'll pull that tight so you can see how that just pulls those opposing edges together. If you have trouble getting your thread to pull through, particularly if you're using waterproof canvas, you can pull each thread up individually towards the end that you're working from. I'll show you how I would do that. So if you need to tighten the slack from down the bottom, You can pull the first thread tight. You can use the blunt end of your needle too. Pull the second thread tight. And you're just working that slack up. And then you're just going to continue along. And I like to pull it taut as I go to make sure that I am keeping my lining edges opposed. Once you've sewn all the way across, knot your thread. And then you can tuck it through the seam line. Poke your needle back out. And then I like to pull that a little tighter and snip the thread so it can then tuck back in. Then you can press any creases out of your lining and tuck it in. And by comparison to the pouch that we sewed on the sewing machine, you can see that this one is nice and flat, and when we tuck it into our pouch, it's going to sit nice and flat in the bottom of the bag. This one has the ridge, which if you're doing a waterproof canvas, you are going to struggle to do this. I've tried. It's, in my opinion, not worth it for me, so I sew waterproof canvas closed. But if you have the time and the patience to sew any cotton woven linings closed, then I really like the nice flat result that it gives you. After you've pressed that lining, turn it out, press the outside too if you have any creases there, and then you will be all finished. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.